Welcome back to the recipe book. Now that we learned about routing in the last course section, it's time to add it to our recipe book course app. This is the structure of our app thus far, and we already got a lot of components and so on. Right now we implemented the navigation in our application with ngIf though, and that is not really the best way of navigating around. Instead, I want to use the Angular router to load pages and to allow the user to, well, switch between pages. In this section, however, we will not only add the router, we will also add one new component, the recipe edit component, because now that we have a way of loading different pages, we can also add this. This is the component which we will fill with some life after the forms section in this course, which will then allow us to create new recipes or edit existing ones. So I want to set up routing in this section, and we definitely need routes to load either the shopping list or the recipe book. But inside of the recipe book section of the app, I want to have some child routes targeting the recipe detail or recipe edit component. These components, which will always be loaded on the left side of our list of recipes, should be loaded dynamically, and only one of the two should be loaded at a time, therefore child routing. So that is the general structure. Let's now put this into practice and build our application and add routing to it, starting in the next lecture. So here is the course project in the state we last left it. ngserve is already running in a terminal, and now I want to add routing. Now let's start with the root routes, with the routes for our overall application, before we then dive into the child routes. You learned how to add such routes, and therefore here's a challenge for you. Try implementing the main routes of our application, so to load the recipe page and the shopping list page on your own. So right now, I will give you a couple of seconds to pause the video and try this on your own, then we'll implement this together. So, were you successful? Here is my solution. For the root routes, I will add an app routing module, as shown in the routing section. So let's add it in the app folder, the app routing.module.ts file. Now in there, as you learned it, we're going to export a TypeScript class which is called app routing module. And this module has only one purpose. It will provide the routing to our application. It will bundle all the routing functionality, so to say. Now here we need to add ng-module to this class to transform it from a normal TypeScript class into an Angular module. And for this, we also need to import ng-module here at the top. Now, ng-module takes a JavaScript object in which we can configure it in greater detail. However, we won't need to configure that much for our routing module. Mainly, we will need to register our routes. So let's set them up first. I'll add a constant named app_routes, and this will be of type routes, just like that. Now, routes needs to be imported from @AngularRouter. And as you learned, routes simply is just an array of JavaScript objects where each object represents a route. So let's add the first route. Now, which routes do we need? As mentioned, a route which loads our recipe section and a route which loads our shopping list section. So let's start with the recipes. I'll set up a path which will be displayed in the URL and which will allow us to go to that route. And let's say recipes sounds like a good path for this, so that you can visit your domain and then /recipes to reach this route. Now, when we visit recipes, I want to load the recipes component. So I'll assign that component here, the recipes component. And of course, we need to add the import of that component. So make sure to add this at the top, pointing to the recipes folder and then the recipes.component file. That's our first route added. Of course, one route is not everything we need here. We also need a second route. So I'll quickly duplicate this. And here I now want to target shopping list. So let's set up this route too. And here, of course, the goal is not to target the recipes component, but instead we want to target the shopping list component, our second main route. And as the recipes component, we need to import this and add the import statement at the top. With that, we got two routes to load. And we also got a problem. When we first visit the page, we will navigate to neither of the two. We will just visit the path with, well, basically an empty path, so just our domain / nothing. Therefore, we should add another path here, another route. Here I want to target an empty path, so basically the path we will reach when we load the app for the first time. And here we could now either also load the recipes component, but that's not really what I want to do. Instead here I want to redirect to /recipes. So I will redirect to and now /recipes. Now let's try implementing it like this. In my ng module here, I now will import the router module. Like that. You have to import it from @AngularRouter. On the router module, we can call for root, and here we should pass our app routes to configure this router module Angular ships with. With that, our routes are now configured and added to the Angular router. Now, since we are in an extra module here and we want to get this into our main module, into our app module, I need to export this readily configured router. So I will add the exports array here and simply export router module. Now important here without calling for root, because we already did that. Now it's really all about exporting this configured router. With that configured and exported here, we can go to the app module, and here in the imports array, we should import our app routing module, and of course also add this import here at the top, so that you make sure to import app routing module from ./approuting.module from this file. With this, routing was added to the application. Now we need a place for Angular to render our routes. So that is something I will set up right now in the app component. Here, where we currently use our ngIf trick to decide which route should be loaded, well, here I will remove this approach and instead add the router outlet to mark the place where the Angular router should render the component we should load depending on the path we are at. With that, we got a place to load our routes. Now, we got no links as of now, we will add them soon, but let's first check if this all works. So with ngserve running, I will save this to trigger the recompilation, and then I will have a look at the running app. Here we get an error. And the error message gives us a hint on how to fix this. But what's the issue? The way we configured it, we will always redirect the router, because the default matching strategy of the router is for the path, it will see if it's a prefix of the current path. And the empty path, which is our redirect route, if you check it here, this route here, uses an empty path, and therefore this is part of any route we visit, because again, the default matching strategy is prefix, so it will check if this empty path is a part of the total path. And of course it is, it's part of every path. So that wasn't a problem when we were redirecting from, let's say, something to somewhere else, because now we had a very specific path, and of course we would also redirect something / anything else, but it would not be part of every route. Well, an empty path is part of every route. It's easy to be fixed, and actually the error message told us how to do that. We have to add the path match property here and set this to full. This overrides the default of prefix and says now only redirect if the full path is empty. So we won't redirect on any other paths. With this, if we save this and we reload the page, here we see this now works and we were redirected to recipes. I can demonstrate this if we reload the page. Again, we're gone to recipes. And if I try loading the shopping list path, that also works. So navigation works. Now the goal is to hook up the links in our navigation, because that of course right now is not working anymore. In the last lecture, we added routing. We set up our routes for this application and we can load them, but the links are not working as expected, so we should fix this. With our main route set up, we can go to the header component, and here I want to change the way we navigate. I no longer need the click listeners here, And also I don't need the ref elements, so we should remove that so that our app doesn't reload, because right now if you click the links, it will simply send a request to the server and reload the page. So remove that. And I can also remove the onSelect method here and remove the event emitter, the header component. So basically all that code, also the imports. And now we can simply use router link. And here I want to create an absolute link to /recipes. And for the shopping list, here I will create an absolute link to /shopping list. And of course, you could also use that alternative syntax taught in the last lectures, in the last course section actually, where you would enclose router link into squared brackets, and then you would pass an array between the double quotation marks here to configure the individual segments of your path. But since here all I want is to go to these root routes, there is no need to do so, and that is the quickest way of setting up our paths here. So with that, if we save this, we should already see that navigation is working again, and it is, that's great. But I also want to mark the active route here. So that is what I'll work on in the next lecture. In the last lecture, we added navigation, and we are now able to switch between our pages here. That's great. Now I want to mark the active route. And actually, Bootstrap, the CSS framework we're using, gives us a class to mark the active route. If we add this class to the list item which holds the link, it's the active class there. If we save this, now this is marked as active. Of course, it doesn't change because I hard-coded it into there, but this is the class we dynamically need to add. Well, and you learned how to do this. We got a helpful directive for this, the router link active directive. Here we simply define the class we want to conditionally attach to this element whenever the link on this element or nested inside of it, like it's the case here, gets active. So here that would be the active class as we just saw. And the same of course for shopping list. So route link active should also be placed on this one. And with this you see it's still active, but now it switches because now the CSS class gets applied to the correct route. So that's now working. With that, let's make sure that when I click a recipe here, we don't actually reload the app as we do now. If you watch this reload icon next to the browser URL bar, that happens because we still have this ref element on it. So we will fix this and then think about the next steps of our app. In the last lecture, we styled our active links here. Now I want to fix the behavior that whenever I click one of these recipe icons here, we reload the page. And that simply happens if we have a look at our recipe list component, which of course is responsible for displaying the list. Here in the recipe item, which is the individual item we're clicking, we have a link with this ref attribute here. Let's remove it because that will actually send a request to the browser and therefore reload our page. If we remove this, you see now I can click it, but now we no longer got the cursor, which looks like a hand. We can quickly add this manually though by simply adding style and then cursor equal to pointer. And now we should have the pointer, which clearly indicates that we can click this, but now we don't reload the page anymore. Now for the drop down here, we should also make sure that all these links are not reloading the page, because right now they are. And that is something we have to fix in the recipe detail component. Here, we also need to remove these ref elements here. And I already added the style with the cursor, which is set to a pointer to the first anchor tag. Let's also add it to the other two. And with that, that should be fixed too. Now, if we select something here, we don't reload. Let's now also do that for the dropdown. Right now, clicking the dropdown also reloads the page. That, of course, has to be fixed in the header component. And here, we reload the page because our dropdown also has this anchor tag or this ref attribute on it. So we should get rid of this and then maybe also implement this style cursor pointer setup to get the right mouse cursor. Let's also do the same for the individual anchor tags inside of that dropdown. So I also removed ref there and added my own cursor style. So with that, this now all works fine. Of course, the dropdown doesn't do anything. We'll add this later, but the app is working again. And therefore we made a big step into the right direction. So with this all added and set up here, our root routes seem to be working fine. But now I want to change the way we load the recipe when we click on one here in the list. I actually want to load that via child routing. When we click new recipe, I also want to load the to be created recipe edit component here on the right, where we now have the detail component. And the same for the case that we click edit here. So that is something I definitely want to add. I want to add these routes, these child routes. So that is what we should work on next. As mentioned at the end of the last lecture, the next goal is to implement child routing for our recipe routes here. So that when we click a recipe here, we actually load it by adding, let's say, slash and then the ID of that recipe in our recipes array here in the URL. So recipes 1 would load the first element, or recipes 0 actually, since we started 0 in the array, and so on. So that would be great if we could load our recipes like that and render them here then. So with a child router again. And the same for new recipe and edit, but for that we will need a new component. Let's implement this in a second step. The first step should be to make these items clickable and load the detail component as a child route here in a new router outlet probably. We will also need another new component then for the case that we first visit our page. In this case, we should have a starting component which kind of says, please select a recipe. Something we right now do by displaying this template here in our recipes component, here the ng template, but that will then also be removed because all I want to have inside of this div with the callMD7 class here is our router outlet. So again, this is a challenge for you. Try implementing this child routing, or at least try to do the first steps of that, setting up the router, creating that component which basically says please select a recipe, and then loading either that component or the detail route, the detail component, depending on whether we click the recipe in the list or not. Certainly a challenge, but also something where you can practice a lot of the things we learned in the last lectures. Starting in the next lecture, we will do this together, so then you can see my approach on implementing this. So, were you successful? Here is my solution. As I said, I want to implement child routes. So I will do this by going to the app routing module here, and on my recipes, I'll add the children property. Now, children also takes an array of routes, and each route still is just a JavaScript object. Here, the first route I want to have is the empty path, so that we just visit /recipes/nothing, the default case. Here I want to load that new component I was referring to, which will simply hold the text we have in this ng template for now. Now for this I will quickly create this component, and I'll use the CLI for that. With ng-gc I can generate a new component, and this component should now go into the recipes folder, so recipes, and then slash, and here you may simply choose that folder. So recipes, and I will name it recipe start, so the recipe start component. With spec false, I prevent this spec file from being generated. So with that, we got our recipe start component here. And as I mentioned before, all I will do is I will output here, maybe in a h3 tag now, please select a recipe. So really simple. With that set up, with our start component set up here, I now want to use that. It has been added to app module automatically by the CLI, so make sure that this is the case. And now in the app routing module, here, I will load this component. So the recipe start component, this one here. Make sure to add the import at the top from /recipes/recipe start component. And with that added, we got our first component, which can be displayed inside of our recipes component. Let's try this out, because that should be all we need to get started with it. In the recipes component, because again, this is, and that's important, this is the component, the recipe component here, is the component where our child routes are registered. So it is in this component's template that we need to provide a router outlet for the child routes to be rendered. So I will do this here. I will add a router outlet here. And when I save this with ngserve running, this looks pretty good. We see please select a recipe, and clearly that is not a paragraph anymore, so it seems to be our new component. Of course, if we click somewhere, that doesn't work anymore, because we only have the router outlet there. Our old logic of loading a recipe is completely broken, but we will restore it soon. Actually, we can already take the first step for restoring that functionality. I'll add another path here to the child routes of recipe component. That path should be :id. So a dynamic segment added after /recipes. That's of course something you have to keep in mind. All child routes always come after the path of the parent route. So all these routes here will have /recipes in front of it. So add /recipes/id, with id being a dynamic parameter. Here I want to load my recipe detail component. We also need to add the import to that component up here, of course. So from the recipes folder, then recipe detail, and then the recipe detail component file. With that, we now at least have a route which would allow us to load this component. And we can kind of see this in action if we manually enter 1 here, let's say. It tries to load the recipe detail component. Of course it will break, because there we try to output data which we no longer get, because our old logic of transferring data from the list item to the detail component doesn't work anymore. But we'll fix it, and we'll actually start fixing it in the next lecture. In the last lecture we started adding our child routes, and now loading the recipe detail component doesn't work anymore. The reason for this is that here we use recipe all over the place, and that's a property of this component, but it's a property set through property binding with add input in front of it, so it awaits to be set from outside the component. Since this component is set through routing though, this won't work anymore. So we have to change how we receive the recipe here, how we set the recipe. And we can change it because keep in mind, in our route, which we define here, we pass this ID, which is a dynamic parameter. So we should be able to load a recipe by the ID, which will simply refer to the position in the array of recipes. So here is your challenge. Try fixing the recipe detail component to somehow use that ID to update the recipe which is displayed, to fetch it from the recipe service. Of course, you will need to implement some method in the recipe service which allows you to get that. Here is your chance to pause the video. Thereafter, I will solve it together with you. So, were you successful? Let's fix it together. In the recipe detail component, we clearly can remove add input, because that's not how we receive the value anymore. So we can also remove the import of add input. That of course also means, before we forget it, that in the recipe item component, we can remove the onSelected click listener here, because that will not be how we pass the value anymore. And of course we could also remove the onSelected method here. That is something we don't need anymore. Of course, that also allows us to remove the recipe service from this component and remove the import. So we're cleaning up quite a lot here. In the recipe list component, we don't have to change anything. And in the recipe component itself here, we already did make a change and add the router outlet. So now in the recipe detail component, we somehow need to get our single recipe. And we know that we will get the ID from the router. So let's first fetch this ID. And you learned that for this, we need to get access to the activated route. So let's inject it here of type activated route. Make sure to add this import here from @AngularRouter. This import is important to enable TypeScript to identify the type you're trying to inject here, and with that Angular is able to use it. So now we get this route, and now we have two ways of retrieving the ID. The first one would be to simply bind it to route this route snapshot params ID. But this will only work for the first time we load a detail component. Now keep in mind, the menu where we can click on one is on the left. So we will be able to choose a new recipe whilst we still see the details of another one. So we probably want to react to changes in our recipe ID because that's absolutely possible in our app. So that is not the approach I want to use. Instead, what I want to do is I want to use my route, the params observable, and subscribe to that observable. Now with that, we can react to any changes in our route params, and we will get them here of type params as we learned to be imported from @AngularRouter. And now we can really react to a new ID. So we should probably store that ID here in a property of our class. It will be of type number. So we should set this ID equal to params ID, though we know that what we get back here will be a string. So we should cast it to a number by adding a plus in front of it. So now we will have an ID in the form of a number, which we can use to identify our recipe. Well, with this information, we want to load our recipe from the recipe service, and for that we need to change our recipe service because right now we got no way of loading a single recipe by ID. That's something we can easily implement though. We can simply implement a getRecipe method, which takes an ID of type number, and then we can simply return this recipes and select the item at this index. We could also rename ID to index to make really clear what that number will be in the end. You could also call slice before doing that, because slice would now give you a copy of your array, though it won't be a deep copy, so the objects still are the same anyways, so you can also directly return the object like this. You could of course also create a hard copy of that object with object assign, for example. That's not what I want to do here though, so we return a single recipe. Now back in the recipe detail component TypeScript file, after fetching an ID and storing it, I want to fetch the new recipe. And I will later also show why I needed to store the ID here. So let's fetch the recipe using our recipe service whenever the ID changes. Then I will call getRecipe and pass my ID as an argument. And with that, we should be able to indeed make our application to work again. By going manually to recipes 0, we indeed see the detail view for the schnitzel and with 1 for the burger. So that is working. Now we also need to enable these links here to work again, because right now they're not doing anything. With our child routes added in the last lecture, let's now make these links work again so that we can really choose an item from that list. The place to make these links work, of course, is in our recipe list, the recipe item here. That is where we have the anchor tag, and that is where we should set the link. We can set a link with router link, but now we get a dynamic segment in the path. So now I will bind router link with squared brackets, because now I want to pass this array, which allows me to really configure segment for segment of my path. Now, the first segment is also the only segment that will be the ID I want to load. So I will use a relative path because this element here, the list, already is loaded at /recipes. So whenever I just add the ID here, that is already all I want, because then we're going to end up at recipes/ID. Now, to get the ID, I need to pass this extra information to the recipe item component. We're not doing this right now, so let's do that. I will add a new property binding here. So I will add the index here, and the index will simply be a number, and I will add input at the beginning. With this, I can now pass in the index of this item from outside, and I'll do this from the recipe list component. Here, besides sending the recipe itself, I can now also pass the index, and of course I have to retrieve that from my ng for loop. So here I'll simply bind I to index to get the index of of each iteration basically. And then I'll pass this index I to the app recipe item and bind it to the index property there, this property we just created. As a side note, with the ID being passed to this component now, you theoretically could update this component to now use our recipe service and the getRecipe method we just created to fetch the recipe by ID. But I will leave it as it is here, but that would be one way of refactoring or restructuring this component. The important thing for us now is that we have the index property in this component now. And that is all we need for this link. So I want to pass the index here, and keep in mind, this is for a single component, so that index will be different for each instance of this component. So if we save this, we can see it already at the bottom of the page. This looks all right. And I can switch between 0 and 1. So that looks pretty good. Now it would also be nice to style the active item here though. And that is something I'll do in the next lecture. In the last lecture, we made our child routes links here work again. Now let's make clear which one is selected by marking it. We can mark the active link by adding, manually, the active class to it. If we do this, all are marked as active, because of course it's added to every instance of this component, because I hard-coded it in there. So that's the right class, but of course we should add it dynamically with good old router link active directive. And here I simply want to pass active as the class name, because we just saw this is the CSS class we need to add. And with that, it's working as expected. And this is all we needed here. You also see that recipes is still marked as active at the top, because we still are at /recipes and then at a child route, but that doesn't matter for this to be marked as active because it's not set to exact matching, and actually we want the behavior we have right now. So that all looks pretty good. Now we can move on to make sure that we can click this new recipe button and this added recipe button and actually do something once we do click them. So with child routing almost finished, let's make sure that we can create new recipes and that we can edit the existing ones. So for this, we need a new component. So let's generate this first. I'll use the CLI again with nggc, and I want to store it in the recipes folder. And here I will name it recipe edit. And I don't want to create this spec file, which is why I set it to false. So with this, if I shrink down the other files, we get this new recipe edit folder here with the recipe edit component. We'll work on the content of this file after the forms section, but I already want to load it and I want to retrieve the route parameter. So to load this, what I will do is I will go to my app routing module and I will register a new route here. The first route is for a new recipe. So maybe new would be a good path so that we have /recipes/new in the end. And with that, we could load our recipe edit component here. And of course, you need to add the import here from the newly created recipes/recipe edit folder. Also make sure that it was added to the app module. And this is done automatically as always by the CLI, but you need to ensure that it is added to declarations and as an import here at the top to have it work correctly and to be able to load it. So with that added here, we have our new recipe route. Now I'll duplicate it to also have a :id/edit route maybe, so that we have the ID available in this route because we need to load it. But I want to have a /edit at the end so that it's clear that we're in edit mode. And this is the same component. That's also the recipe edit component. I will, in the component, determine whether we are in edit mode or not. Now with this setup here, if we go back to the application and we enter /edit after this, we see recipe edit works, so that's great. But we will see something maybe unexpected if I try to go to /recipes/new. Now we try to load the detail component and therefore we get an error because it basically failed to get a recipe with the ID new. And that's exactly what went wrong here. If we visit recipes/new, due to the way how we ordered our routes, it will try to parse new as an ID, because the route with the dynamic ID parameter comes before the route definition where we have new hard-coded into the path. So we should switch these two routes so that the new route comes before the route with the dynamic parameter. Otherwise, how would Angular know if whatever we passed right now should be interpreted as the new hard-coded path or as a dynamic parameter? So with this order, now we should be able to load new without any issues. If we hit enter, that looks all right, and we can also still load the existing recipes. So with that, these paths are set up too. The missing piece is now to retrieve the ID in the recipe edit component and to determine whether we are in edit mode or not. So we added our routes for the edit component. Now let's go to that component and retrieve the ID and therefore determine whether we are in edit mode or not. I will inject the activated route in there as you learned it before from @AngularRouter. And in ng-on-init, this is a good place to now retrieve the ID. As before, I want to do this dynamically, so I will use my route and the params observable and subscribe to that. And here I will receive my params, which are of type params. And here I then want to retrieve the ID on which I'm currently working. I will store the ID here in a property named, or not named ID, but of type number. So here I will set this ID equal to plus to convert it into a number, params ID, because that's the name of our dynamic parameter in our route setup, right? With that, we retrieve that ID here, but I also want to find out whether I'm editing the recipe or creating a new one. I actually want to store this information in a new property, edit mode maybe. I'll set it to false initially, so initially could say we assume that we are creating a new recipe. We are not in edit mode. Now I will check this whenever the parameters change. Then I will assign a new value to edit mode. And here I will simply assign the value of the following check. I want to see if params has an ID property. So if it has one, then this will actually be a string with the ID. Otherwise it will be undefined. So by comparing it to null and checking if it is not null, I'm checking does it have the ID. Because params, and that there the ID, will only be not undefined if we are in edit mode, because then an ID will be present. If this check returns true, so if the ID indeed is undefined and therefore equal to null, this will return false because I'm checking the opposite, and therefore we are in new mode. And we can check this by simply logging it in the console here, edit mode. Let's see if this works. We're at 0 edit here, and it returns true, and now we're at new, and it returns false. So that seems to work. This is a nice way of checking in which mode we are. So with that, we are able to retrieve the ID of the element we want to edit and to find out whether we are in edit mode or not. Now I want to make this edit link here work and the new recipe link, because these are both things which are not working as of now. Let's work on this next. And actually, this is a nice challenge for you. Make these links work. Make sure that when we click this link or this button, we get taken to the recipes new page or the recipes edit page for that respective recipe we had loaded. It's a nice challenge for you. In the next lecture, we can view my solution together. So were you successful hooking up these buttons? Let's do it together. I want to start with the new recipe button. And for that, I'll go to my recipe list component, which is where I have this button here. And I simply want to add a click listener to it. On new recipe could be a fitting name. So let's copy that name and add it to our TypeScript code so that here we have the method which will get triggered. And now I need to inject the router to be able to navigate to this route I want to go to. So I'll add my router here of type router to be imported from @Angular router here. So I'll add this import. And with that, in on new recipe, I simply want to target or use my router to use the navigate method to target this path I want to go to. Now, which path is that? We already are on /recipes here. Keep this in mind because we're on the recipe list. So I can use a relative route and simply add new to it. Now, to be able to use a relative route in the navigate method though, we also need to inform the router about our current route. So let's inject this too. Here, the route, of course, of type activated route needs to be added. An activated route should also be added from the @Angular router package. And then I'll add my JavaScript object, add the relative to configuration, and point to this route, to my current route. With that, let's see if that works. Back in the application, let's try this new recipe button. That looks great. So let's try going to just recipes, works, select a recipe, works too. So that is indeed working as expected. Now we should do the same basically for the edit recipe, though there we also need to pass our ID. The recipe detail component is of course the place where we have this link here, the edit recipe link. So I'll add a click listener and say on edit recipe here. I'll also copy this name into the TypeScript code of the edit recipe component, like this. And then here we also need to get access to the router so that we can call the navigate method. So let's inject it of type router as before. Make sure to import the router from @Angular router. And now that is why I stored the ID in this property here. With that stored, I can now use my router here to navigate. And I want to navigate, well, basically to the current ID and then add it. Now I could simply add it to the current route. So let's add relative to here, this route. And let's see if this works as expected. If I click edit recipe, we go to 0 added and the same for 1. So actually we don't need the ID here in this case then. Why did I get it then? Well, simply for demo purposes. This is an absolutely fine way and probably the way you will navigate. The alternative though, and just to show this how that would work and to practice this, is to use navigate. And now let's say we move up one level and then we want to add our ID again, so this ID, and then add it. So now I'm deliberately constructing a more complex path, simply to show how that would work. So now that is also relative to our current route, so this route. And with that you should see that it still works, because what we do is we go up one level, so to just /recipes in this case. Then we again add our ID and then add it. And we should see that if I click this button again, even if we reload the app to be sure that it did indeed update, it works as before, now with a more complex setup. Again, you would probably use the first one, which is, well, comment out the second one. I just wanted to highlight again how that works, how you can use that more complex navigation and also navigate around with this go up one level command you see here as the first segment of this more complex path. However, again, just adding edit to the relative, or to the current route I should say, is of course the straightforward way. In the last lectures, we added a lot of routing functionality to our app. It's looking pretty good. We got all the main pieces tied together. One thing I want to bring to your attention again is we are subscribing to params here in the detail component and in the edit component. Now, as I explained, You don't need to clean up the subscription here. I just want to bring it to your attention again. In other cases, where you use your own observables you created and not managed by Angular therefore, you will need to clean up this subscription. So definitely keep that in mind if you work with your own observables. Here for now, we can simply proceed with this setup and let Angular do the cleanup work.